father tells his son to be reasonable. A boss tells his employee to be flexible. A friend tells a man to just let it go. And in that moment, something inside him dies. Not dramatically, not obviously, just quietly. A small piece of who he could become vanishes, replaced by who everyone needs him to be. Carl Jung called this the murder of the self. And it happens every single day to men who think they're just being practical, just being mature, just being realistic. But here's what Jung discovered after decades of studying the human mind. Every time you compromise what you know is true, you're not building bridges, you're digging graves, not for relationships, but for the person you were meant to become. And the most dangerous part? You don't even notice it happening. You think you're being wise. You believe you're being strategic. You convince yourself this is how adults operate in the real world. Meanwhile, your actual self, your authentic nature, your deepest potential is suffocating under layers of reasonable decisions that made everyone else comfortable and left you empty. Watch what happens in any office, any family, any relationship. A man knows something is wrong. He feels it in his gut. He sees it clearly. But everyone around him has a different opinion. They tell him he's overreacting. They convince him he's being difficult. They pressure him to just go along. And because he wants to be liked, because he wants to avoid conflict, because he's been trained his entire life that compromise equals maturity, he buries what he knows is true. He smiles. He nods. He agrees to something that violates his deepest instincts. Jung saw this pattern destroy more people than any external enemy ever could. Because here's what nobody tells you about compromise. It's not a negotiation between two parties. It's a betrayal of one party by itself. When you compromise your truth, your values, your instincts, you're not meeting someone halfway. You're abandoning yourself completely and hoping they'll appreciate the sacrifice. But they never do. They just learn that you're someone who abandons themselves, which means you're someone who can't be respected. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Jung spent his entire career helping people understand this one devastating truth, that most people are living as someone else. Not intentionally, not consciously, but through 1,000 small compromises that seemed reasonable at the time. Their parents wanted them to be stable, so they compromised their passion. Their partner wanted them to be available, so they compromised their mission. Their friends wanted them to be relatable, so they compromised their growth. And each compromise felt small. Each one seemed justified. Each one appeared to be the mature, reasonable, adult thing to do. But here's what Jung discovered. These small compromises don't stay small. They accumulate. They compound. They create what he called the shadow. This massive dark territory in your psyche filled with everything you've denied, suppressed and betrayed about yourself to fit in with others. And this shadow doesn't just sit there quietly. It grows. It festers. It eventually explodes in ways you can't predict or control. Think about the man who spent 20 years compromising. He took the safe job instead of the risky venture because his family needed security. He stayed in the dying relationship because leaving seemed selfish. He bit his tongue in meetings because speaking up might cause problems. He sacrificed his health because everyone needed him available. He abandoned his dreams because pursuing them would inconvenience others. And now he's 45, successful by every external measure, completely dead inside. He can't explain why he's miserable. He has everything he's supposed to want. But Jung would see it immediately. This man has spent 2 decades murdering himself slowly, compromise by compromise, until there's nothing left of who he actually was. And the worst part? Everyone thinks he's handled life perfectly. They point to him as an example of maturity. Look how reasonable he is. Look how flexible. Look how he never causes problems. They're praising him for his self-destruction while he's wondering why success feels like failure. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Here's what Jung understood that terrifies most people. You're not compromising consciously. You're being controlled by unconscious forces that you don't even recognize. Your need for approval, your fear of rejection, your terror of standing alone. These aren't conscious decisions. They're unconscious programs running in the background, making you compromise before you even realize you're doing it. The man who refuses to compromise isn't being stubborn, he's being conscious. He's recognizing these unconscious pressures and choosing to resist them. When someone tells him to be reasonable, he hears the real message, which is, make yourself smaller so I feel more comfortable. When someone tells him to be flexible, he translates that to abandon your standards so I don't have to meet them. When someone tells him to let it go, he understands what they really mean is, stop reminding me that I've already let everything go. This consciousness is what makes him unstoppable, because he's not operating from unconscious programming anymore. He's not compromising to avoid feelings he hasn't examined. He's not bending to pressure he hasn't understood. He sees the game clearly. Every request for compromise is someone trying to pull him down to their level. Every demand for flexibility is someone uncomfortable with his firmness. Every plea for reasonableness is someone threatened by his certainty. And once you see this pattern, you can't unsee it. You start noticing how often people ask you to compromise yourself, but never compromise themselves. How frequently they demand your flexibility but offer none of their own. How consistently they need you to be reasonable while they remain unreasonable. Jung called this projection. People projecting their own self-betrayal onto you and demanding you participate in it. The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases. Here's where the man who refuses to compromise becomes truly dangerous. He stops accepting universal rules about how life should be lived. Society says you need to compromise to succeed. He asks, succeed at what? Becoming someone I'm not? Tradition says you need to be flexible in relationships. He asks, flexible about what? My core values? My deepest truths? Convention says you need to be reasonable with people. He asks, reasonable according to whom? People who've reasoned themselves into mediocrity? This questioning, this refusal to accept inherited wisdom without examination, this unwillingness to compromise based on what works for others, this is what Jung meant by individuation. The process of becoming an individual rather than remaining a copy of collective expectations. Most men never individuate. They spend their entire lives as high-quality copies of what society expects. They're successful copies, respected copies, well-adjusted copies, but copies nonetheless. The man who refuses to compromise is attempting something far more difficult and far more valuable. He's trying to become an original. Not original in the sense of being weird for weirdness' sake. Original in the sense of being true to his origin, to his essential nature, to who he actually is beneath all the conditioning. And this process requires absolute refusal to compromise the core, because every compromise of essence creates distortion. Every betrayal of nature creates neurosis. Every denial of truth creates shadow. Jung saw this in patient after patient. Successful people, functional people, people who'd done everything right according to society's standards, sitting in his office completely lost because they'd compromised themselves into someone they didn't recognize. Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people. The man who refuses to compromise has looked at his darkness directly. He knows why he wants to compromise. He understands the fear driving the urge to fit in. He recognizes the terror beneath the desire for approval. And because he's faced these shadows in himself, he can see them operating in others. When someone pressures him to compromise, he sees their fear. When someone demands he be reasonable, he recognizes their insecurity. When someone needs him to change, he understands their discomfort with themselves. This seeing doesn't make him cruel, it makes him unmovable, because he understands that their pressure isn't about him, it's about them. They're trying to manage their own anxiety by managing his behavior. They're trying to feel better about their compromises by getting him to compromise too. They're trying to validate their self-betrayal by witnessing his. But the man who refuses to compromise won't participate in this collective self-deception. He won't betray himself to make others feel better about betraying themselves. He won't shrink to make others feel bigger. He won't compromise his truth to validate their lies. And this refusal, this simple, quiet, absolute refusal, creates a kind of power that people can't define but definitely feel. There's something different about him, something solid, something that doesn't bend when everything around it is bending. Jung called this the integrated personality, when conscious and unconscious align, when outer behavior matches inner truth, when the face you show the world is actually your face, not a mask you've compromised yourself into wearing. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. Jung wrote this after watching countless people destroy themselves rather than face the simple truth of who they are. Because here's what facing yourself requires. It requires admitting every compromise you've made, every time you abandoned yourself, every moment you chose comfort over truth. And this admission is more painful than most people can handle. So they keep compromising. They keep bending. They keep adjusting themselves into smaller and smaller boxes while pretending this is growth. This is maturity. This is wisdom. Meanwhile, the man who refuses to compromise has done the hardest work. He's faced himself completely. He's admitted every fear. He's acknowledged every weakness. He's recognized every shadow. And on the other side of that brutal honesty, he discovered something revolutionary. That his refusal to compromise isn't arrogance, it's integrity. That his unwillingness to bend isn't stubbornness, it's strength. That his insistence on his truth isn't selfishness, it's self-respect. Where love rules, there is no will to power, and where power predominates, love is lacking. Here's where this gets complex. Because the man who refuses to compromise will be accused of not loving others. Family will say, if you loved us, you'd compromise. Partners will claim if you cared, you'd be flexible. Friends will insist if you valued us, you'd adjust. But Jung understood that this isn't about love. It's about power. They're trying to use love as leverage to gain power over your choices, your path, your essential nature. Real love doesn't require compromise of essence. Real love celebrates your truth even when it's inconvenient. Real love supports your becoming even when it's uncomfortable. What they're calling love is actually control disguised as care. And the man who refuses to compromise can see this clearly. When someone says compromise your truth for my comfort, they're not offering love. They're demanding surrender. When someone insists bend yourself for my security, they're not expressing care. They're exercising control. The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. Jung believed relationships should be transformative, but most people think transformation means compromise. They think being changed by someone means being diminished by someone. But real transformation doesn't require self-betrayal. It requires self-expansion. The man who refuses to compromise understands this distinction perfectly. He's not refusing to grow. He's refusing to shrink. He's not rejecting transformation. He's rejecting deformation. He's not avoiding change. He's avoiding compromise of his essential nature. And this creates a specific kind of relationship dynamic. He attracts people who want to grow with him, not people who want to shrink him. He connects with those who celebrate his strength, not those threatened by it. He builds bonds with people who respect his boundaries, not those who constantly test them. Your visions will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakes. The man who compromises is dreaming. He's living in a fantasy where everyone will eventually appreciate his flexibility, where all his sacrifices will be recognized, where his reasonableness will be rewarded. But he's asleep to the reality that people don't respect compromise, they exploit it. That sacrificing yourself doesn't earn gratitude, it invites more demands. That being reasonable with unreasonable people just makes you their doormat. The man who refuses to compromise is awake. He sees clearly that his power comes from within, not from others' approval. That his value isn't determined by how well he accommodates everyone else. That his strength is measured by his ability to stand firm, not his willingness to bend. This awakening is what Jung called consciousness, and it's what separates men who appear powerful from men who actually are powerful. Think about the difference. The man who compromises appears flexible, appears reasonable, appears mature. Everyone likes him. Everyone thinks he's handling life well. Everyone appreciates how easy he is to deal with. But inside, he's collapsing. He's lost touch with who he is. He's confused about what he actually believes. He's uncertain about what he really wants, because he's spent so much time being what everyone else needs that he's forgotten what he needs. The man who refuses to compromise appears difficult, appears stubborn, appears rigid. Not everyone likes him. Some people think he's handling life wrong. Some people find him hard to deal with. But inside, he's solid. He knows exactly who he is. He's clear about what he believes. He's certain about what he wants, because he's spent his time being himself rather than performing for others. And this internal solidity creates external power that no amount of people-pleasing can match. I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. This is Jung's most empowering insight. You're not defined by the pressures you face. You're defined by how you respond to them. Every day, life presents opportunities to compromise. Your boss wants you to do something that violates your values. Your partner wants you to be someone that contradicts your nature. Your friends want you to participate in something that betrays your standards. These aren't problems. These are tests. Tests of whether you'll choose becoming or belonging, whether you'll choose truth or comfort, whether you'll choose yourself or everyone else. The man who refuses to compromise passes these tests. Not perfectly, not without cost, not without pain, but he passes them by choosing his becoming over their belonging, his truth over their comfort, himself over their expectations. And each time he passes these tests, he becomes stronger, more certain, more himself, more unstoppable. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Jung wrote this because he understood that refusing to compromise requires accepting yourself first. You have to accept your nature even when others don't. You have to accept your truth even when it's inconvenient. You have to accept your path even when it's lonely. Most men can't do this. They need external validation before they can accept themselves. They need others' approval before they can approve of themselves. They need society's permission before they can give themselves permission. But this creates an impossible situation, because society will never fully approve of someone who refuses to compromise with society. Others will never fully validate someone who doesn't need their validation. The collective will never give permission to someone who's trying to escape the collective. The man who refuses to compromise has accepted this reality. He's accepted that his path requires self-acceptance without external confirmation, that his journey demands self-approval without others' applause, that his becoming necessitates self-permission without society's blessing. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Here's what the man who refuses to compromise notices. The people most irritated by his refusal are the people who've compromised the most. The ones demanding he be flexible have bent themselves into pretzels. The ones insisting he be reasonable have rationalized their own self-betrayal. The ones claiming he's being difficult have made themselves easy to everyone but themselves. Their irritation isn't about him, it's about them. They're irritated because his refusal reminds them of their compromise. His firmness exposes their flexibility as weakness. His certainty highlights their confusion. His self-respect makes their self-abandonment obvious. And rather than face this truth about themselves, they try to change him. They try to convince him he's wrong for being uncompromising. They try to pressure him into joining them in their self-betrayal. They try to pull him down because his elevation makes their position feel lower. The foundation of all mental illness is the unwillingness to experience legitimate suffering. Jung understood that compromise is often an attempt to avoid suffering. You compromise your truth to avoid the suffering of standing alone. You compromise your values to avoid the suffering of conflict. You compromise your path to avoid the suffering of being misunderstood. But this avoidance of legitimate suffering creates illegitimate suffering. The suffering of self-betrayal, the suffering of lost identity, the suffering of existential emptiness. The man who refuses to compromise has accepted legitimate suffering. He suffers the loneliness of his path. He suffers the conflict of his boundaries. He suffers the misunderstanding of his choices. But this legitimate suffering creates strength, clarity, character. It builds him into something solid rather than breaking him into pieces. Meanwhile, the man who compromises to avoid this legitimate suffering ends up experiencing far worse. The illegitimate suffering of not recognizing himself, of not knowing what he believes, of having everything externally and nothing internally. The man who refuses to compromise becomes unstoppable because he's stopped trying to be acceptable to everyone. He's stopped performing for approval. He's stopped adjusting himself to fit. And in that stopping, he discovers something most men never experience. That real power comes from being immovable in your truth while the world spins around you. That real strength comes from standing firm while everyone else is bending. That real freedom comes from refusing to compromise yourself, even when compromise seems like the only option. This is what Jung meant by the individuated man. Someone who's separated from the collective unconscious. Someone who's found their own center. Someone who's become who they truly are, regardless of what anyone else thinks about it. And this person, this rare, uncompromising, fully individuated person, becomes a force that nothing can stop. Not because they're fighting everyone else, but because they've stopped fighting themselves. Think about the phrase that just captured your mind while watching this. The phrase that expresses your relationship with compromise, with truth, with becoming yourself. That phrase living in your thoughts right now is your unconscious speaking to your conscious mind. Drop it in the comments because writing it makes it real, makes it conscious, makes it something you can't ignore anymore. That simple act of typing your truth is the first step of refusing to compromise it. Hit subscribe right now because you just spent 20 minutes examining something most people avoid their entire lives. You looked directly at the uncomfortable truth that compromise might not be maturity, but self-betrayal. That means you're ready for the next level of understanding, the next uncomfortable truth, the next insight that will separate you further from the sleeping masses and closer to who you actually are. Smash that like button because this video is doing something specific to your mind. It's making the unconscious conscious. It's exposing the compromises you didn't know you were making. It's revealing the self-betrayal you've been calling wisdom. Supporting this video means supporting your own awakening, your own individuation, your own journey toward becoming someone who refuses to compromise their essential nature for anyone's comfort. Another video is coming that will challenge something else you thought you knew, expose another pattern you didn't know you were following, reveal another truth that will make you question everything you've been taught about how to live. Stay ready for that.